Well, apparently this is take two because I think I recorded when I had just finished another lecture and I must have not ended that meeting. So we get to do this all over again. At least I do. Welcome, chapter 3. I wanted to put it in presentation mode so it looks nice and you can see my cool graphic about the wheels of the head always turning. This chapter is usually done in 3 lectures, so I will break them up so as not to be monotonous and give you a chance to rest in between each of our 3 portions to this chapter. The first one that we're going to be talking about that I'm going to be lecturing through right now is brain states and consciousness. Then a little later I will record and put together the sleep and dream portion. Unfortunately, sleep and dreams is one of the most, if not the most, question-friendly lectures. So it'll be a lot shorter than our class time because I usually put in a lot of time for you guys to have your questions answered about sleeping and dreams and all of that stuff. As if any of you attended the dreams meeting from the Psi Beta Club, you would know a little bit about that. And there were a lot of people asking questions and making comments. And then finally, we will end with a third lecture on drugs and consciousness, and we will talk about addiction as well. This seems to be a fan favorite of people from the class. No, not because they're interested in doing drugs. They're interested in how drugs actually affect the brain. And if you're wondering why it's in the consciousness chapter, it's because depending on the drug or medication or thing that you do, um, then I then it changes your level of altering. So things like caffeine, which are stimulants, cause you to be more awake and alert, and things like depressants, like alcohol, as we will talk about, cause you to become sleepy. And it changes your level of functioning and alters your medication. Yeah. So, we will start with this first part today. There will be videos that accompany this lecture or these lectures, and I will sort of parse them out. There's 3 or 4 that actually are pertaining to this lecture, and you can watch them right when this lecture is over, or maybe you've already watched them, who knows. And then there will be another one for sleep and dreams, and drugs and addiction, we don't really need one, but I will talk about a very interesting phenomenon that's not in the book. So stay tuned for it. When we look at consciousness in the realm of psychology and throughout the history of psychology, when Wilhelm Wundt, yes, going back to the prologue, opened the first psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany in 1879, he defined psychology as the study of mental life, but psychology was also more specifically defined as a description and explanation of states of consciousness. So even at the very beginning, at the very roots of psychology, we see that consciousness has had a place atop this sort of food chain, right, if you will, or the conceptual chain. As we talked about through the history of psychology, in the first half of the 20th century, we had Freudian psychology, where he talked about the unconscious mind being locked away from anywhere where we could access, although he did talk about conscious and unconsciousness. But that gave way, of course, to behaviorism. And so the first half of the 20th century, basically, at least for 40 or 50 years until the 1960s, there was no emphasis on consciousness. The emphasis from Freud was on the unconscious mind, which he didn't really care much about consciousness. And with behaviorism, even though some of it was an unconscious type of behaviorism, there wasn't much paid attention to that. They only paid attention to the behavior. They didn't care about mental processes. They didn't care about emotions. And specifically, they didn't care about levels of consciousness because they said, we don't care if you're conscious or not conscious. The only thing we need to worry about is directly observing your behavior to see if there are any changes. So it wasn't until this cognitive revolution in 1960 or after the 1960s that attention came back with humanistic psychology. We had the attention brought back to mental processes like thoughts and to emotional states as well, being just as important as our behavior. What that did was give way for consciousness to come back. So consciousness itself was a huge central type of study. And they wanted to see specifically how we could alter consciousness on our own. So there were a lot of studies done on hypnosis, on meditation, and different forms of drugs that could alter your level of consciousness, which also showed how it plays an important role in the way that you think, process information, all of those cognitive processes, and how those may change with the change in our level of consciousness. So that brings us to where we are today, looking at more modern influences like neuroscience, knowing what parts of the brain do what, as well as cognitive psychology and how we process taken information, where it's stored. And if we combine those two, there is a discipline called cognitive neuroscience, which allows us to combine how we process information with where and what brain structures we use. And because of this combination, we can see that consciousness has once again reclaimed its place upon the throne as a very important area of research. Now, I don't mean it's the king of psychology research, but it's definitely up there in terms of importance. So what about consciousness? This would be about the time where I would go around and ask you guys what you think that consciousness means and how we would define it. And as you've seen, what's been happening the last couple chapters with definitions is that when we have a theme for the chapter, we start off almost right away with definitions. So some people would say consciousness is just being able to answer a question out loud, that it's knowing that we're awake and alert, knowing where we are in our environment. So the book uses that last definition. It's the book defines consciousness, and this may be important in an upcoming exam or something like that. That consciousness is defined as our awareness of ourself and our environment. So in this case, if you were sitting in class with me today, you would be consciously aware that I was talking. You would be hopefully consciously paying attention and not thinking of other things or sleeping or something like that. And you would be able to try and do your best to concentrate on the things you're supposed to, which include taking notes, looking at my slides, listening to me talk. But there may be a lot of other things going on around the classroom. You may have people talking near you. You may have gestures being made. You may have notes being passed around you. And although our brain is amazing and magnificent, that does not mean that you are going to be aware of everything that's going on in your environment. Our brain is made to select attention on what it thinks is most important. And sometimes if something that's happening, even if it's right in front of your face, is not as important, then your brain just switches it off, or it goes unconscious, or we just literally don't see it. And this is what's known as inattentional blindness. So even though we're awake and alert and doing something, because we're concentrating and we're putting attention on things, we may not see things that are right in front of us or right to the side of us because our attention is directed elsewhere. Now, this is the point in the lecture where I would go to 3 videos, which I have provided the links for, so you can watch them. One about looking at not white people, but white players wearing white shirts and how many times they pass a basketball. Then there is a magic-based demonstration, which is pretty cool, looking at inattentional blindness. Spoiler alert, it may not just be the magic that you're supposed to pay attention to, but everything, right? Just to prove a point. And then the last one is another attempt by doing that game that is very fun, that sometimes we play on the scoreboard at Dodger Stadium, with a ball under Dodger hats. But the traditional game is a ball of a little red ball under some cups, and the cups are being shuffled around, and you have to keep your attention to figure out and try to remember and be able to recall and know where the ball is under which cup after they've been jostled around, shall we say. So those are the 3 videos that you would watch in conjunction with this. So you could pause the video and watch it now, or just when the lecture's over, no big deal. They'll still be there. So coming back to that, and there will be a 4th video as well for this lecture. It's very video heavy, which I know is always fun for the students. We have different states of consciousness, as this table points out. Some of these occur spontaneously. When you're in class, sometimes you can't help but think about that crush of yours, or maybe it's close to lunchtime and you're thinking of lunch, or your attention is diverted for some reason, and spontaneously you just start thinking about what you need to do for the rest of the day, what you're going to have for lunch or dinner, right? What if you have to run any errands after school, things like that. You start daydreaming, basically. And that could be just thinking about other things. It could be thinking about other people. It could be thinking about what tasks you have to do. And that seems to occur spontaneously. So your attention is directed away from what's going on, me lecturing, for example, and you start to drift off into your own little world. Drowsiness, as you're going from fully awake to getting ready to go to sleep. Your brain is secreting melatonin. And so spontaneously, when your brain determines that you're getting ready for bed, you start to feel a little drowsy. Your attention is not as sharp and clear. If you're watching South Park or something, you may not get all the jokes, or you may miss a couple. If you're watching a movie where you have to pay a lot of attention, you may not be able to see everything that's going on because your level of consciousness is getting lower, going towards sleep. And when you're already asleep, boom, that's the dream state. Now, you may not think that you dream, but everybody dreams, as we'll talk about in the next lecture. And it is a different state of consciousness. You are unconscious, but your brain is still dreaming. And there are many different theories as to why we may do this, which we'll get to in the next portion of the lecture. Some of these are physiologically induced. Hallucinations can be induced in a couple of different ways. One could be lack of sleep. If you don't sleep for 3 or 4 days, you could start to hallucinate, which is seeing, hearing, or sensing, of the 5 senses, sensing things that aren't actually in our environment, because your sensory neurons and sensory receptors are out of sync, so to speak. Sometimes they're giving extra information that the brain is picking up, even though that information is actually not in the real world. So that could be from severe lack of sleep, or it could be from taking something that alters it physiologically, meaning taking a drug, a hallucinogen, like LSD. Marijuana at least distorts your concept of time, and things like that. Mushrooms and other types of hallucinogens can be induced, injected, put under the tongue, eaten, whatever it is. And then when we speaking of food, on the right-hand side, you see food or oxygen starvation. So if you don't eat for a long time, or if you hold your breath or don't get proper oxygen for a while, you can also start to hallucinate. Your sensory neurons and receptors will be going off as if things are happening. In the middle, we see orgasm. That causes release of endorphins. It causes a euphoria, which can be pretty intense, at least for a few seconds, and at least for those little bit of time, those few seconds or so, it causes a different sort of state of consciousness, right? A euphoric state, so to speak. We can also psychologically induce states of consciousness. Meditation is one of the ones that I talked about in that first slide, which doesn't really work so well for me because I can't shut my brain off. So even though I'm trying to tell my brain to shut off, it's like, hey, screw you, no way. Hypnosis, which doesn't necessarily work so well on people like myself. And when I say hypnosis, I don't mean like when you awake and I snap my fingers, you're going to cluck like a chicken, because I don't believe in that type of hypnosis. And I don't know many people that really do. But when we talk about hypnosis, suggestibility, putting you in a different, more calm state or sleepy state or things like that. So that type of hypnosis, um, I'm down with. And then the last one on the bottom left is sensory deprivation. And sensory deprivation is basically a way of externally cutting out the five senses from you. And the way that this is usually done is you are placed into a sensory deprivation tank, which is a big metal tank, kind of looks like a big coffin, not to scare people. But basically, there is nothing inside except a little layer of water. And I will explain why there's water in it in just a second. But when you close the lid, it is soundproof. So all sounds, unless you're talking to yourself, which is not recommended, all sounds and sound waves are cut off from the inside of this tube, from this tank. Obviously, light waves are. When you get in, it is pitch black. And that's the point, because you want to cut off all visual integration. You want to cut off all, or input. You want to cut off all auditory input. You're obviously not eating or tasting things or smelling things. So taste and smell are cut off. And the reason that there is a thin layer of water in the tank is because you want it to cut off your sense of touch. So the only thing that you'd have in there, the only sense potentially you'd have, is the sense of touch of yourself in the tube or the tank. So if you're in water, then very quickly, and you're floating, very quickly your sense of touch will have that. Remember, we talked about that sensory sensory adaptation. And so your touch receptors will go numb very quickly, and all five senses will be cut off between you and the real world. And so for the 30, 45, 60 minutes, however long they say to be in there, is just you with all of your external conscious processes basically turned off. Now, this is something I've always wanted to try, because again, meditation doesn't work well for me. So that would be kind of cool to try it out, but it's something I've never wanted to pay for. So if anybody wants to take their professor along and do it as an experiment, cool, if you're paying for me, or because I can't seem to get a grant from any of the schools to do it for quote unquote research. So, here we are. The next thing I'm going to do is potentially blow your minds a little bit by giving you an alternate kind of explanation from a cognitive neuroscience perspective. We talked about the combination of cognitive neuroscience. On the right, you can see that a cognitive neuroscience is neuroscientist is one that explores and maps the conscious cortex by looking at what types of processing we have, gathering information, storing information into memory, thinking actively about things, and what parts of the brain light, and combining it with neuroscience to ask what parts of the brain light up. So they may have, and we're going to ignore the bottom part really quick, but they may have their own interpretation of what we would call consciousness, because we talked about it being awake, alert, aware of our surroundings, able to answer questions to people. And what we see on the left, on the top part, was based on a study that was done about 12 to 15 years ago. And basically, they were asking people to either imagine playing tennis or to navigate through a person's home. And what we can see is on the bottom side, we have healthy volunteers that are able to either pantomime the answer, playing tennis, navigating their house, or of course, being able to consciously answer. So they could just speak whatever they wanted to speak about playing tennis or navigating their house in the way that anybody would. But on top, we have a patient in a vegetative state. Yes, that means this patient is in a coma. And so conventional thinking, the way that we define consciousness as being awake and aware of our surroundings and alert, you would say that a patient has no way or is in no way conscious, right? But allow me to challenge that at least just a little bit. So first of all, we see that there are two questions: playing tennis, or at least imagine playing tennis, and navigating your home. We talked about the fact that they can sometimes read minds as a cognitive neuroscientist using an fMRI while you're functionally doing something. We talked about the fact that um, if I were to hook you up to an fMRI and I were to tell you to look at a picture or read this thing, or look at this flyer for the next club meeting or something, that your visual cortex back in the occipital lobe would light up, like we saw in that picture in chapter 2. So then I could say, well, if that part of the brain is lighting up, it's your visual cortex. It means that you are actively looking at something using your visual information. In this same way, when we are imagining playing tennis, you are either doing one of two things. You're either pantomiming the actual movement, which is the motor cortex that would light up, or right in front of the motor cortex at the back of the frontal lobe is an area called the premotor cortex. And remember that pre just means in front of. So it's directly in front of the motor cortex. And no, we didn't point it out in chapter 2, or I didn't point it out because it wasn't necessary then, but bear with me and you'll see where I'm going with this. Or I guess hear where I'm going with this. The premotor cortex, if somebody is at the free throw line in basketball and thinking about how they want to shoot the free throw, or standing in the batter's box playing baseball and thinking about how they're going to swing, or before you actually do something, like imagining playing tennis, just thinking about the ways that you would move involves this secondary motor area called the premotor cortex. So even if whether you're pantomiming, swinging, forehand, backhand, serving, running around the court to get the ball, you would be using either that motor cortex or at very least, that premotor cortex. If you're just answering the question and saying, well, now I'm serving, now I'm, volleying, now here's a forehand, here's a backhand, now I'm running from one side of the court to the other, you would at least, even if you're not actually pantomiming, use your premotor cortex. So down here in the bottom left, we see tennis imagery of a healthy volunteer, and that part of the cortex lights up in yellow and red, or orange, meaning that that's the part of the brain that's being used, and that would be the motor premotor area. So whether that person is just merely picturing it mentally, or whether they're actually pantomiming playing tennis, those areas would light up. An interesting thing is, if you look above that top left corner, is that the patient who is in a vegetative state, who cannot answer, cannot talk out loud, doesn't open their eyes, still has that part of the brain light up. Now, I will be the first to point out that it is not as big an area, or maybe it's not as bright as the healthy volunteer who's awake and alert, but that same area of the brain is lighting up, which may suggest that that person in a vegetative state is still thinking about how they would play tennis using that same area of the brain. Let's move on to the second question, navigating your home. And you see on the bottom right, there are 3 areas of the brain that are lighting up. Well, if you're navigating your home, and I were to ask you in class or in a lab, you wouldn't actually be at home. You would have to be thinking about how you'd walk through your house or go through your house to figure out, oh, well, if you were telling me about it, the living room is the front room when you walk in the front door. If you go to the rightish, in my house, then you're going towards the kitchen through the dining room. If you walk to the left, you're going to get to a hallway where there's either a bathroom or you can go to one of the bedrooms. Is there a back door? How many windows are there in your house? You might not, well, now you're at home, but you might not be at home if you were in class with me, but yet you'd still be able to sort of mentally picture these things and walking through the house to see if I asked you to count how many windows there were. So there's your premotor cortex again. As you can see, that's lit up in the healthy volunteer, nice and yellow. But towards the back and towards the bottom of the brain, you see 2 other structures that are lit up. One that kind of looks like it's curved a little bit on the bottom in the temporal lobe, or what would be the temporal lobe, and that would be the hippocampus. We talked about the hippocampus in the limbic system, that it's involved in memory, and that it's your internal GPS system. So if you're trying to navigate through your house and remember and try to think of how, and the memory of how many windows are in each room as you're mentally picturing them, in order for you to do that, the hippocampus has to be active. So again, we see in yellow the hippocampus lighting up down below. And in the very back of the parietal lobe, remember we talked about attention and knowing where our limbs are in space within our environment in sort of the back of the parietal lobe. Well, that's that third area towards the back of the brain up there that is lit up. And what we see, again, lo and behold, in the patient in the vegetative state, again, not to the same degree and not even maybe as much of the cortex, but you see a little bit of lighting up and maybe not quite as yellow, maybe a little more yellow-orange in the motor or at least premotor area, in the hippocampus, a little bit sort of disjointed, but there, and in the back of the parietal lobe. So from a cognitive neuroscience point of view, they suggest, as now we turn our attention to the bottom right of the slide, and we, as a cognitive neuroscience, looking at the brain structures that are lighting up in the fMRI, they suggest that consciousness may not just be the ability to be awake and alert and answer questions and aware of our environment, but maybe consciousness is just the synchronized brain activity. Even though the person on top, the patient, in both questions, whether it's playing tennis or navigating their home, the patient's brain structures lit up very similarly to the person who is awake and alert and may be able to answer the question verbally. So we can challenge this idea of consciousness from a cognitive neuroscience point of view and say maybe it's just if the brain structures are showing synchronicity or synchronized activity, the person could be considered conscious to a degree. The person in the coma will probably never remember that they were asked these questions, but if their brain could respond in that way, then perhaps that's a different way to interpret consciousness as opposed to the book's way. Now, don't get confused. We still want to use the book's definition. This is just challenging that notion that it's only being awake and aware of your surroundings. And you don't have to admit it, but I know I just blew your mind at least a little bit. So one of the things that we had been talking about is that we have a brain that does conscious processing. And as we talked about in sensation and perception, we also have unconscious processing. Subliminal is what we called it according to sensation and perception, right? According to the absolute threshold definition or the difference threshold or things like that. For the absolute threshold, things that did not get detected more than 50% of the time were called subliminal. We saw evidence that subliminal sensations are real and that they could possibly be used in subliminal advertising. It just didn't go over so well because you have to be really already primed and in that headspace, I guess you could say, to let it affect you. But what it did tell us is that subconscious and unconscious things are there. So our brain processes both. It processes information on an explicit or conscious track, and we have a different track with potentially different areas of the brain that process unconscious, implicit stuff. In chapter 2, one of the things that we pointed out, or I pointed out, is the cerebellum has many different sort of functions. The one for exam 1 was looking at balance of coordination, but one of the other functions that I said we would be discussing later is that it helps to process unconscious information. So not only does the brain process conscious and unconscious information, but it but it is able to do so simultaneously. And that's something that we call dual processing. We can process conscious and unconscious information at the same time, as well as rapidly toggling back and forth between conscious and unconscious. Our brain is very powerful in that sense. In fact, we can apply this idea to our sense of vision, as we talked about rather extensively in chapter 6. In this case, in chapter 6, what we learned is that there is a pathway from the back of the eye where the optic nerve leaves the blind spot of the retina, goes and crosses over, majority of it, right, at the optic chiasm, and then there's the two stops, the thalamus and then the visual cortex. Well, that is what we call the primary visual pathway. which means that there is a secondary visual pathway that actually goes through the middle of the brain called the midbrain. Not something we needed to talk about in chapter 2 because we did not need to pile on any more information than it already contained. So this midbrain area goes back to the eyes, and it's sort of a secondary, what we would call unconscious pathway. So that primary visual pathway, the one we learned about in chapter 6, is the conscious or explicit one. If there is damage to that pathway after it's left the eye, either on its way to crossing over at the chiasm, at the thalamus, or from the thalamus maybe to the visual cortex, if that is interrupted, then the person will lose all conscious visual activity. But if it leaves that secondary pathway unharmed, then the person's unconscious visual pathway is still intact. And that would cause something we call blind sight or blind sight awareness. There is a fourth video that I am including in this that goes along with this original research that I'm about to show you. But basically, blind sight awareness is a condition in which a person can respond to a visual stimulus without consciously experiencing it. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that you would have no conscious awareness of being able to know what I'm doing if I asked you how many fingers I'm holding up, or if I were to tell you that there's something in your way or there's nothing in your way. You would have no way of knowing that. But unconsciously, the brain is able to detect if there are things in the way. So in a semi-famous experiment, a man named Lawrence Weiskrantz showed this demonstration of blind sight and the two-track mind. And what he did was, he told this in this artist rendering, you can see Weiskrantz in the back, and this person who has blind sight in front of him. Essentially, he told the patient that the hallway was completely empty. Now, the patient has no conscious visual input, so couldn't see how many fingers he was holding up. He couldn't see if there was anything in the hallway. He just kind of had to take the researcher's word for it. So Weiskrantz, trailed right behind him. You can see Weiskrantz in the back with a file in his arm. And the person in front of him was told this is an empty hallway, even though you can see that there were obstacles in the way: a box top, a file drawer, a trash can. And although the person could not physically consciously see, the unconscious parts of the visual pathway were still there. And so the patient meandered around, or was able to avoid all of the obstacles in the hallway, even though he had no awareness consciously that anything was there. He believed, Dr. Weiskrantz, that the hallway was empty, but when there were things in his way, the unconscious portions of his visual system allowed him to go and walk around them. So you could put chairs and tripods and things, as you'll see in the video that I've attached to this page. So what that shows us is, when we pay attention to something, either we consciously or our brain consciously is choosing the most important things to pay attention to. That, of course, is part of the parietal lobe's job. So that the fact that we focus conscious awareness on a particular stimulus, if it's me lecturing or my slides, or, going back and forth to that and you writing in the notes, you are focusing your conscious awareness on a particular stimulus. You are using your selective attention. And when we do this, when we have selective attention, that means that we can fail to see things right in front of our own faces sometimes. And that's, remember, what we called inattentional blindness, failing to see the visual objects when attention is directed elsewhere. Now I'm going to focus your attention on another term that we used in chapter 6. When we talked about the visual system, we talked about the fact that at the same time, different clusters of neurons were processing different pieces of information. As the puzzle pieces were coming up from the visual system, from the eyes to the brain, we were able to use one cluster of cells to process the outline or shape of the object. We were able to use different a different cluster of cells to determine the color or colors, whether it was in motion, and how close or far away from us it was, depth. And we could see all these things, even though that there are, different sets of neurons, clusters of neurons that are processing this information. When we get to the perception part, the big picture is put together at the same time. So all of these different aspects of the visual system being processed and interpreted at the same time is what we called parallel processing, where conscious and unconscious information at the same time, if I were to go back really quick, is called dual processing. So parallel processing can also be used in this way when we think about putting all 5 senses together or taking aspects of a problem that we're looking at. Let's say you're in an escape room and you are trying to solve riddles and look at the clues of what's going on and maybe hear if there are other voices or things going on. You are processing many aspects of a problem simultaneously. And this is actually the brain's natural mode of information processing. Not only are we processing different shapes and different colors with the visual system, at the same time we're processing different sounds that make different noises. We're looking to see if two things are related or not, in our touch, in our taste, in our smell. There are many different things that combine for the different flavors that we eat. So we are processing this and then putting it all together at the same time for not just the visual system, not just the 5 senses, but for a lot of different things. So we call this parallel processing, just like we did with the different portions of cells in the visual system. And as I pointed out a few minutes ago, we can rapidly toggle between activities. It's very common today. I know that the millennial and the post-millennial generations claim that they're better at multitasking simply because they've been exposed to it a lot longer. Those basically in the millennial generation and beyond, post-millennial, I guess, is the new one, grew up where there was internet all the time. So I'm not going to say shorter attention spans, but shorter clips, as opposed to half-hour sitcoms and things like that. We have a lot of TikTok. Before that was Vine. We have YouTube videos that can be very small or very large amounts of time. And so those generations claim, well, we can multitask because we've been doing it since we were born. And maybe, yes, they are probably slightly better at multitasking than people that did not grow up with these same things, but that doesn't mean that the multitasking itself, that they're going to be really good at juggling many things. What we know is that multitasking distracts brain resources because you have to put your attention on multiple things. You can't select your attention on just one thing if you're multitasking. That's literally the definition. So your brain resources that are allocated to driving, if you're not concentrating on the road because you're talking to someone or reaching for your phone, that can cause distractions, even if you don't think it does, because you are taking away from your selective attention. In fact, what studies show is that brain activity decreases an average of 37%, more than a third, when a conversation occurs. This could be a hands-free conversation on the phone. It could be you just talking to somebody in the passenger seat. Or for me, my son is always sitting in the back seat, so talking to him. When you use a cell phone, that actually increases the accident risk up to 4 times. And maybe it's because of you're trying to select music, or maybe you're trying to dial a number, things like that. In fact, when you're dialing or just reaching for your phone, crashes or near crashes increase up to 7 times for that. That's why hands-free is so great. I have an iPhone, so it's always, hey Siri, call so-and-so. And that way I don't even have to take my attention off of my driving. Of course, it'll dip a little bit, but not even close to that 37% when conversation occurs. One of my best friends since I was like 7 years old is a guy named Seth. And one Sunday morning, I got an interesting phone call from Seth because he was changing freeways from the 710 to the 110 or something like that. And his cell phone had fallen down in front of the passenger seat. And he decided, of all times, remember the "it can wait" texting and driving advertisements you see around town, they're still around. I get them on the TV when I'm pause my show and stuff like that. He didn't take that advice to heart, and reached for his phone to pick it up while he was going from one freeway to the other. And when he looked up, he was too late and he rear-ended another car in front of him. So the question I had for him was, why would you do that when it can wait? And two, why would you call me when you could call your wife? And he said, I don't know. I just, anytime something happened, I'm used to calling you. And I was like, great. Well, I have to go teach a class, so call your wife. And I think she was busy with something. So my wife ended up coming to his rescue. But the moral of the story is, do not, if your phone falls down between the cracks or in front of the passenger seat, just let it go until you can either pull over or get to a red light or somewhere where you don't have to worry about looking up the whole time, right? So that's pretty much the end. I always check the next slide to make sure I'm right where I'm supposed to be. And like I said, because I deliver these lectures in 3 different sessions, I'm going to give you 3 parts to this episode, to this chapter, so that you have a chance to have a natural break. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the next couple lectures. And go watch the videos if you haven't. All right. We will get together soon.